In this video, I'll be cleaning and maintaining my Angus trim Type 16A.4 longsword. This sword is sharp, and so I do need to be careful, and for anybody who's going to clean their own swords, same thing, be really careful. I'm just going to lay it down on a little bit of foam. The table that I have outside is pretty dirty. As you can see here, it's not really in the best shape. I've got a little bit of water spots and rust on it. See this like rust spot sort of right here. I maybe didn't clean it as best as I could before putting it away, so now I'm going to have to do some maintenance. I am going to start by putting on gloves for two reasons. One, I am using WD-40 and I just hate how it feels on my hands and I find it really tough to wash off. The other reason is I bought Never Dull, which you can see in the tin can there, and that is actually a skin irritant, so I do want to be careful with that. And while I'm getting that prepared, you can see I've also got some cotton rags here. They are lint-free. You can also just use a t-shirt or any other sort of lint-free fabric, I suppose. I also have a little grit pad in the front here, but I will talk about that in a minute. So I'm just going to take one little sheet of my material here. I'm going to tear it up a little bit just so I don't actually waste too much of it. And these I find really excellent. They're super absorbent, and the fact that they're white also kind of helps me know like how dirty the fabric is, so that I'm not just wiping the sword and everything again and again with like the same dirty piece of material. So I'm gonna go ahead, fold that up. I want to get a couple layers of fold before I start wiping this down, only because I don't want my sword to slip through the fabric for some reason and possibly cut me, so the more layers I can get between me and the sword, the better. I'm going to start just by wiping off the old oil that I had on the sword and taking off any sort of residue or buildup that's put on the sword. I'm making sure to keep a loose grip as I do wipe down the sword. I just don't want that blade to cut through the fabric and cut my hand, obviously. That would be bad. And then always make sure that you're reading the label so that you know the product you're using is actually meant for your task. In this case, I want to make sure it's good for steel, and also to make sure if it is a skin irritant that you're using the proper protective equipment. So I'm going to take a little bit of the wadding that is coated in the Never Dull, and I'm just going to wipe down the heavier soiled parts of the blade. And it does say on the instructions to just kind of wipe until like a polish comes through. And so that's basically what I'm going to do here. Again, being really careful about the edge and where the point is. And I'm just going to spot clean all the little bits of rust that are on there first. This does take quite a bit of time, so we're just going to speed right through it. But again, I'm being careful to go down the whole length of the blade with the Never Dull. Once I'm done with the Never Dull, I'm going to use my cotton cloth and just wipe the product off. You'll notice a little bit of discoloration on the white cloth. That's mostly the rust coming off and any other little bits of dirt and stuff like that. Again, being really mindful of the edge and the tip. Again, this sword is sharp, so I want to keep as many layers of cotton between my hand and the sword as possible, but also just few enough so that I'm not unable to do this task. After that, I will flip it over and do it on the other side. Next is WD-40. I don't know if you actually need to shake WD-40, but I do anyway. So I'm going to spray this on the blade, and this is just to take off any extra dirt or debris or anything that I maybe missed with Never Dull. So it just gets sprayed on, and then I'm using my cotton rag to just wipe it off. I'm going to do this down the entire length of the blade again, and obviously I will do this on the other side as well. Next, I'm going to start with this like sandpaper block, and I'm just going to emphasize that this is a super fine grit. I've got 320 grit on here. I have also sprayed it with WD-40. I will only go in the direction of the blade. I never want to go across the blade, always want to go down the length of it, as if there was a grain that I could see visibly, and I'm going to follow that all the way down the blade. I'm using extremely light pressure, and the finer the grit you can get, the better. Just be really careful, only because you really don't want to scratch the finish, or create super deep scratches that might then introduce rust and corrosion. So being super careful, going right down the edge, and there will be a more thorough time to use this, but again, right now I'm making sure there's WD-40, really, really light pressure, and this is just preliminary, again, to get that sort of surface rust and surface discoloration off. And again, I'm using 320 grit. Obviously, the finer grit that you can get, the better, and you just want to be super, super delicate, and of course, be really aware of where your fingers are. As soon as you start using this block, you will be very tempted to not think about where your fingers are. Alright, so taking again the WD-40, this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to spray down the whole length of the blade from hilt to tip. Now you'll notice that I've put down a cotton cloth on the foam. I didn't want the WD-40 to soak into the foam. I'll explain why later. So basically all I've done is covered the blade and I'm going to let it sit for a while. When you're returning to your workspace, please be mindful of your tip. Now this has sat for about 10-15 minutes. We're just going to return to that sandpaper block and do the same thing we did before, light pressure, following sort of the grain down the length of the blade, always down the blade and never across. You'll see some of that dirt and debris and stuff coming up. You want to keep polishing that down, and you can, obviously the dirtier it gets, you can wipe it down with your cloth, but again, just down the whole length of the blade. And then again, wiping it down periodically with that cloth, making sure you get a good amount of layers in between your hand and the edge of the blade. I'm going to just wipe that down, and I will repeat this process as often as necessary, always making sure I'm reapplying that WD-40 and using my little block, my sand grit block, and wiping it down in between. Now that I've done that on both sides, I'm going to take a clean cloth, or at least a clean portion of my cloth, and wipe down any excess WD-40 that's left on the blade, pick up any extra little dust that might have floated on there during the whole process. So I'm also going to wipe down the cross guards here and the pommel, any sort of hardware on the sword, and I'm just basically looking for any little spots that I've missed, so this is my time to really inspect the blade and make sure that I haven't skipped anything. After inspecting it and being satisfied with the results, I'm just going to take WD-40 again, and I'm going to give it a light coat in this case, so a couple extra inches away. I just want a really light layer before I put it away in storage, and I'm going to kind of dab along the blade just to make sure there's no like pooling or anything in the fuller or any like excessive spots. So I'm just making sure it gets a nice even coat, nice little light layer of WD-40. And gonna touch it up on the crossguard and the pommel before I put it away. I store my sharp swords in hard rifle cases, which do come with foam, and I said I would come back to the foam thing. If you get the foam oversaturated with oil or lubricant or any debris that you've cleaned off of it, it will stain the blade on long-term contact when you store it. You can see a better example here, the little round spots right in the middle of the blade. That's from the ridges of the foam having oversaturated oil and staining the blade. Now that my sword maintenance is finished and the sword looks all shiny and clean, I can put it away. I want to make sure I keep a nice thin layer of oil on it, and at this point now the next step would be to sharpen it. And sharpening is its own different set of skills, and I'll save that for another video. As always guys, thanks for watching my video. If you want a little bit more detail on my process, please read the video description, and if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up in the comments. Thanks again guys. One more super pro tip before I go, maybe don't wear nitrile gloves outside in the summer in Arizona when it's 45 degrees Celsius. That's all sweat. Gross.